We'd like to call this evening's meeting of the City Council to order. Welcome our listening audience, as well as our audience on Cable Channel 22. Madam Clerk, the council mics are open for roll call.
Mayor Artis.
Sure.
Councilmember Akison. Here. Councilmember Sear.
Here.
Councilmember Grayeb. Councilmember Jensen. Councilmember Montalongo. Councilmember Euler.
Here.
Councilmember Riggenbach.
Here.
Councilmember Ruckriegel.
Here.
And Councilmember Turner.
Present.
We have a quorum present.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. After establishing a quorum is physically present, which we have done, it's my duty to read our electronic attendance process. A notice was received by a member of the City Council in accordance with the rules established in Ordinance Number 16142, and the member will be deemed authorized to attend the meeting electronically unless a motion objecting to the member's electronic attendance is made, seconded, and approved by 2/3 of the members of the City Council physically present at the meeting. If no such motion is made and seconded, then the request by the member to attend electronically shall be deemed approved by the City Council and the presiding officer, and shall declare the requesting member present. So we received the required notice of 48 hours, of minimum 48 hours by Councilmember Moore to attend this meeting electronically. Is there any discussion on this? Councilwoman Akison?
Thank you. I just wanted to mention that Councilwoman Jensen also requested to attend this session electronically, but I think that there are some technical reasons and perhaps the number of hours. I don't think she was within the window of 48 hours, so she wanted me to make sure people knew that she was away at work and not at home eating bonbons and watching a movie.
Okay. So regarding Councilwoman Moore, who did fulfill the requirement of 48 hours notice, I'm seeing no objection to that, and we will consider her in attendance at this meeting. Councilmember Moore, you are in attendance at this meeting.
Thank you.
At this time, I'd like to invite everyone to join us and rise for a moment of silent prayer or silent reflection, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance.
The United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Madam Clerk.
We have one item. Item number 17-297, a communication from the city manager with a request for a policy session on the 2018-2019 biennial budget.
Okay, thank you. We have a motion by Councilman Sear to open the policy session, seconded by Councilmember Ruckriegel. Seeing no discussion, please cast your ballots to open the policy session. Councilmember Moore?
Yes.
That motion passes unanimously. Thank you. I'm going to hand this over to the city manager for he'll outline his presentation and what he's going to do tonight. Just for the listening audience and for everyone's knowledge, the reason for the policy session this evening tonight, the manager will go over the information that he provided us to start with on the budget. What we're looking to do tonight is to give him recommendations on support for specific items or not. There may be votes tonight that would only be advisory in their capacity to give the manager further confirmation of where the majority of the council is tonight. None of the votes that we make tonight are binding. None of these votes tonight are final on the budget or will be until the budget is actually finalized. So what we really want to try to do is provide the manager with as much feedback as we can on the information that he's presented to us. And then his intention will be to bring back, based on that feedback, the first draft of a balanced budget next week. So, Mr. Manager, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I do have some slides that I'd like to walk through this evening for you, for the audience that are here. And then for anyone that is at home, we will have this slide deck and then the memorandum that was sent to council yesterday along with the community feedback report on the city's website. As the mayor mentioned,
Mr. Manager, maybe before we start, I should have mentioned this too. As the manager goes through this deck and any of the other information, if you have a question on it at that time, just so it's fresh in your mind, go ahead and ask for recognition, ask your question, and get clarification, and then we'll move on. Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. So as we look at this, what we wanted to do was provide you with a report back on the 5 public budget meetings that we held in August and September, to also then share some of the findings from the online budget challenge. Then dig into some of the discussion this evening that pertains directly back to the budget for 2018 and 2019, and that is looking at what we can be doing to close the deficit. As you will recall from the discussions that we've had, I asked the department heads to craft 2 different budget scenarios for me. One that would be a reduction of 5 million or 5% of their budget, and another that would be a 10% reduction in their operating budget. So we'll walk through that this evening, and then following the presentation, I want to get some direction from you as to where you feel that we should be working to craft a final budget book, whether that's crafting it that is more reliant on expenditure cuts. Are there new revenue streams you want us to look at, or revenue enhancements you want us to look at, or both? Or what does that look like? So that's really the outline for this evening that we want to work through. Again, as a summary, kind of looking at where we are, this is really just top-line revenues and expenses across all funds. In 2017, the budget that was approved was a balanced budget that had $200 million of anticipated revenues and $199.6 million of anticipated expenses. However, what we're seeing is that in the general fund, our revenues are not coming in at nearly that pace. We'll probably end the year with revenues that are going to be closer to $193 million across all funds. And then we're going to see that as you can see here, from 2018 and 19, we're looking at we have some pretty sizable deficits, and then it starts to close the gap back in 2020 and 2021. Specifically, though, the problem that we're facing is in our general fund. And again, we had approved a budget that had a balanced general fund budget of about $100 million in 2017. We're not seeing that revenues are coming in nearly as strong for 2017, and so it's a significant challenge. So if we didn't make any change for 2018, we would see only $93.3 million in the general fund, with $101.2 million of expenses. That's the $7.9 million budget deficit that we've been talking about. So in an effort to close that's where we asked the department heads to put together 2 different scenarios, a 5% budget reduction and a 10% budget reduction. And we'll get into those numbers here in just a minute. But first, the council had directed us to go out and to talk to the public about our situation, to gather some feedback from the community about that. So we held 5 public budget meetings beginning in late August, running through the middle of September. We held those in each one of the districts. We had roughly about 94 people that showed up. Predominantly, they were city employees. I think that we counted about 32 people that were not city employees that attended those 5 public budget meetings. And we were very pleased that we did have that kind of turnout. I wish we would have had more people, quite frankly, but we did have at least some turnout that came back from the public at those meetings. The issue that we asked, in many ways, we asked the public to share with us what were some of their questions and what were some of their observations. And we put some of this into the community feedback report that will be out on the web. We had some questions that were asked. Are there minimum, and these are just some examples of that. We had questions like, is it possible to have a law that would be passed that would allow each home to meet minimum code requirements upon their sale? So that was one idea that came out of one of the public budget meetings, which was really good. Another question that came from actually, I think it was in the 5th district, was why should I pay for the stormwater utility? I'm not part of the combined sewer area. That was an issue that came up. We heard a lot of questions about police and fire pensions and how could we control some of the costs within that. There were some questions about how we can minimize waste. They had some questions also about how do we distribute income taxes, how do SSAs work. There were questions about are there ways that we can try and balance the budget across all departments, or does it have to be specific to others? So we looked at that. There were some questions about revenues that came up, or observations about what we could be doing differently to try and incent business to come to the community. So overall, it was, I think, a worthwhile endeavor. As I said, I wish we probably would have had a few more people at the meetings. But moving on, we also had the public budget challenge. The Peoria Budget Challenge. As you know, we purchased a license to put together a budget simulation tool for the public to kind of sit in the seat of the city council members. And we gave them a series of choices. And those choices included police and fire and public works and administrative services. It included community development and public works, and then some specific areas of the budget. And we asked, specifically this time, we said, we want you to ask whether or not you want to maintain funding or if you want us to cut funding in expenses. We didn't, other than in capital, we didn't leave anywhere that the public could add any additional funding just because of the severity of the budget hole that we're facing. And so in this regard, we had a couple of observations that I'll make for you here. First, for police, the 48% of the public voted to maintain funding. We had 51% that then voted saying that they would cut it at one level or another. On fire, we had 57% saying that we should remain or maintain funding for the fire department. In public works, the largest vote was for cutting the budget by $700,000. Administrative services, the largest vote getters were to cut administrative services, which is all of the back of the house functions, all the administrative functions, by $1.2 million. Community development, the largest vote getter there was to cut by $800,000. There was a vote to maintain our other post-employment benefits at the current level of funding that we have. And there was the largest vote for capital projects was to cut it by $1 million as we look at trying to make adjustments to the budget. We asked 4 different questions about pension funding, about stormwater infrastructure funding, and about the water company buyout. Nearly 82% of the people said don't pursue a study to do the due diligence on the water company buyout. We then asked, should we keep pension funding at its current funding level of trying to get to 90% funding by 2040 for police and fire, or should we raise that level to 100% funding? 78% of the people that took the challenge said leave it at the 90% level. On the stormwater infrastructure, and I apologize, I just noticed that these percentages are off. The stormwater infrastructure maintaining the current level was the primary perspective that the public said there. So they said, and in fact, I think that number was 67% said maintain the current wet weather drainage program that we have. For the property taxes, now shifting onto the revenue side, no big surprise here. For property taxes, sales taxes, local motor fuel taxes, and utility taxes, the public said keep the current rates that we have. Same with HRA taxes.
Mr. Manager, we have a question.
Yes, sir.
Councilman Sear.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Urich, just a couple questions here. I wish I could have had an opportunity to ask you this question before you started these slides, but we averaged less than 6 constituent per meeting. Did I understand that correctly?
I think right about 6 or 7 per meeting.
Is this the best usage of our resources?
As I think, and I mentioned to you at our last meeting, I think that when it comes to having public meetings like that, we need to find a different way to reach out to the public. Whether that's, putting together videos that we can share on social media that outlines the problem. It seems to be, even with this public, with the online budget challenge tool, we had more people that found out about it through social media than they did through the print media. So that, again, it may be an opportunity that as we look at this in the future, instead of holding public budget meetings, maybe we, and this was actually a suggestion that Councilwoman Moore had, is that maybe what we could do is videotape it, have one meeting, videotape it, and then share that on social media or share it in a different way that the public can view that.
And how much money do we spend on the budget challenge software?
Well, the budget challenge software was purchased in 2015, and it was $10,000. It's a lifetime license, so there's no other costs that we have, and we can use that for as long as the company.
How many responds do we receive this year?
This past year, we had 1,336 respondents so far to date.
Okay, of these 1,336, do we have a part of the software, do we know who the individuals are, or can people take the test more than once?
No, they can take it more than once, and no, we don't know who they are. They're given the opportunity to provide feedback to us at the end. And I would say of the 1,336 people that have taken it, we have about 100 email addresses of people that shared feedback with us, shared the comments at the end, and then they shared their emails with us.
So what's been your experience the last couple of years with this software? Because when I talk to constituents, seems to me like many of them have taken the test more than once. So actually, these 1,300, it's probably a lot less than 1,000 constituents.
Perhaps. Again, this is just another way of providing public outreach to the community about the situation, the fiscal situation that the city is in. This is a way of allowing the public the opportunity to weigh in as many times as they like. And I think that that may be an inherent flaw in the system, that somebody can come in and who is very supportive of one service or another, or one issue or another, and continue to vote again and again and again. But I think it at the same time, it's just giving you a snapshot that you can, again, take with it what you want from it. This is an opportunity that we just thought provided some engagement of the public, and it was an opportunity to share that with them.
Well, I'd like to make a suggestion. Maybe, no, we won't go through this process for another 2 years, but before that, I think we should talk with our marketing and promotional department and really find programs, invest in ways to really engage our public. I mean, I've been to 2 of these meetings, 6 constituent or less. It's ridiculous. And we need more feedback from the population. And I think we're not going to get any if we don't develop a plan to get them engaged with us, so we can really, when I look at these numbers, 1,300, I know there's not 1,300 that respond to the challenge, the budget challenge. So maybe we can develop a program to try to get our constituent more engaged.
Thank you.
Just a suggestion.
Okay. I have Councilmember Euler and then Councilmember Akeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Manager Urich, do we have the opportunity to pull out the results of those 100 and compare the percentages that those 100 provided against the percentages of the whole to see if the trend gets skewed as we go into these? It may have been multiple results.
We could probably take a look at that and pull based upon that. I've got all the raw data that we could certainly try and take a look at that and see if there's a noticeable difference between those people that were willing to put their name on the feedback and those that didn't. So I'd be happy to share that with you.
Yeah, thank you. That would be great information.
Yeah, thank you. Councilmember Akison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate Councilman Sears' questions and comments, and I think I agree with him. I think it would be great if we could come up with a method to get more people coming to meetings and really feeling like they had an opportunity to really give significant input. One thing I am concerned about, though, is how are we protecting ourselves from, if we take this information in and then we use it to make decisions, some of these responses could be from people who have something to lose or gain by participating in it. And I think that you don't want to discount, every person who pays taxes in this city, including city employees, should have and need to have input. But I'm thinking perhaps, and I think it was suggested even in the comments, perhaps there could be a separate channel for city employees to really give their honest assessment without any sort of retribution, so that we get kind of an inside look at their critical view of how the city's being managed and how resources are being spent. But I think to Councilman Sears' point, to just categorically accept this and then use these results to kind of influence where we land, they may not be really representative of our entire city base. You couldn't say, if you survey 2,000 people and you find out that 90% of them don't want X, and we say, okay, our citizens don't want X, and you find out that those people primarily, weighed in that way because they had something to lose or something to gain, we're not making a very good choice. So it seems like there's some work that needs to be done on this particular device.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Manager?
So just wrapping up on the revenue side, we also asked about HRA taxes, garbage fees, licenses and permits. HRA taxes, the public said maintain the current level of funding for HRA taxes. There was a slight plurality that said raise the garbage fees, same with licenses and permits. We then asked some miscellaneous questions regarding pension funding. Again, the lion's share said keep it at the statutory level. On the stormwater utility, the plurality said maintain the program. There were really only two options to raise, and that did get a majority of the vote. And then on the miscellaneous side, we asked about the packaged liquor tax. We asked about a fire service fee or a payment in lieu of taxes to the hospitals, and as well the vehicle fee. And they went down in order from 40% support down to about 17% based upon the people that took that voted for each one of those. So that's just some information. Again, I appreciate the comments, and I'm not saying that you should take this as gospel, that this is what you should do. This is just a snapshot of what people are saying based upon that specific tool. So moving on, and into the meat of the discussion that we need to have this evening. Department heads were directed to come together and prepare 5 and 10% budget reduction scenarios. We wanted to look at this in order to ascertain what the level of expenditure reductions we might need to make. I wanted to give you this first so that you could take this and then decide if that's the direction that you want to head, if you wanted to focus on just that side of the ledger, or if you wanted to look at other items. So in this regard, knowing that we needed to close a gap of $8 million, when we looked at the 5% reduction, we still have a deficit of $3.3 million. So it is impossible to close that gap completely with a 5% budget reduction scenario. So looking at that, obviously the voluntary separation plan will help as we start to get more interest. We've had a couple of people that have already signed up, but it is something that we're going to have to continue to look at and monitor. But as we looked at a 10% reduction in the general fund with the budgets that were submitted by the department heads, we were able to close that gap. So if we are to do this on the expense side of the equation alone, we can close that gap. Now, what that means from a service perspective may not be something that the council finds palatable, and that's something that we want to drill into here. So the first of those expenditure reductions we looked at in all of the back of the house functions and in our general governmental expenditures. We looked at a $2 million reduction there. Collectively in administrative departments, what I mean by that is that would be the mayor and council's budget, the clerk's budget, the treasurer's budget, the city manager's office, legal, human resources, finance, and information systems. So those are your administrative departments. Those are 8 different departments that we have. Collectively, we were looking at a 10% reduction in the budget and also in the workforce. Some of the challenges with that, obviously, is that it's going to mean that we're going to have limited support for the line departments that are out on the street. It will increase our response times and some of the research turnaround times that we have for different things. Our flexibility to respond to council's directives or desires may be affected by that. We also looked at how we might be able to trim on our liability and workers' comp expenses, but that's a risk because there may be, you're really dependent when you start to trim back on liability workers' comp, that you may have additional cases that pop up during the year and you're really beholden to those challenges. We also looked at trying to adjust OPEB and the other post-employment benefits liabilities. So the next department area was in community development. A 10% budget cut in community development is about $250,000. We looked at what that would do. It would affect planning and neighborhood services. It would limit the ability of the department to do special projects. With many of the weed and litter work orders that we were doing, we would have to shift to just doing garbage and litter work orders only. We wouldn't do any private lot mowing. We would just discontinue that altogether. And it would take us more time, obviously, to turn around permits. But those are some examples of what we would have to do on the community development side. On the fire side, there's a couple of things that are helping us out. First, with the 1% salary increase budgeted for 2018, we're actually able to capture some contractual salary savings from what we had anticipated in the budget. That's about $500,000. But going forward, if we were to have to close the budget with the fire department, it would be eliminating the cadet program. We would have to decommission an engine company. And then that one less engine company would mean that we would have to reduce it would reduce the department's flexibility. It would stretch their training times out. It would certainly have an effect on some of their response times. But right now with the department in its current state, there is, I think, 10 vacancies currently in the fire department. So as far as making this adjustment, if we just didn't fill those vacancies, we'd accomplish that without having to actually lay anyone off, which is a good thing. So it could be done with the least amount of pain as possible, I guess, with the fire department. On the police side, again, looking at this, a 10% reduction is about $2.7 million. We have contractual savings of about $700,000 that we're seeing there, again, because they're at a 1% salary for our COLA for 2018. Again, this would eliminate the cadet program. It would, the chief has notified the PPBA, the union, that he wants to change the fourth shift, move to 4 10-hour days. By doing that and changing the starting times, he thinks that's going to be able to generate some savings for the department. This would look at moving the information office to just the day shift only, and then making some staff reassignments back into patrol from public information, traffic, and nuisance abatement, just in order to balance the budget and live within the police department allocation that would be there. On the public works side, it would be a $1.5 million reduction. It would look at suspending the mayor's youth program for a year. We would look at making reductions in materials for supplies like forestry, engineering services, and street maintenance. One of the bigger changes, we would be looking at changing the snow response time from 18 hours to 24 hours. We staff with our own people are on 12-hour shifts in the wintertime. It would stretch out the time that we would be responding to some snowfalls, but we would do it only with city staff. So we would no longer have any contracted employees that would be doing that work. So it would be just the city staff that we would be doing that with. We would adjust our vacant lot mowing down to 16 times a year instead of 18 times a year. And then we would have less summer temporary help. So there would be fewer temps in the summer that would be there working on seal coating and some of the pavement preservation work that we have. So that's $1.5 million in reductions in public works. In addition, on the capital side, and we've talked about this in the past, and this is something we could certainly look at. We know that this year we had about $9 million of unrestricted capital requests. We never have enough funds to meet the needs of of the departments with unrestricted capital requests. We know that road funding is a priority. I would not recommend a budget that would adjust the road funding. The council made it very clear that they wanted to see road funding continue. That's 2 years ago. We raised nearly $5.2 million for roads. But we could pull back to just defining what would be essential capital projects and just simply trying to live within a capital budget that was considerably smaller than the budget that we have today. So that just kind of outlines some of the adjustments that we would be making if we had to make some changes on the expense side. And I would be happy to answer at this point in time before I jump on to revenue if there's any questions that anybody has.
Councilwoman Akison?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have some concerns about the expenses associated with overtime pay. And I know that recently the 2016 compensation report was posted to the city's website, but there are no totals. Do you have an idea, Mr. Manager, what the overtime total is for all city employees as a percent to total of their regular pay?
Looking at that report, I think it was about this was 2016 numbers, and I think we paid about $5.7 million in overtime. $5.7 million in overtime expenses were paid in 2016.
Okay, so the full-time units in our reports is really somewhat distorted because in actuality, we're really paying many more full-time positions. Is that right?
Well, no, you're paying, we have 690 employees. Your management employees, don't receive any overtime. So there's at least, we'll say 40 of your employees on the top. So 650 employees would potentially be eligible for overtime. So those employees are working. If we were to hire, well, let me back up. We had $5.7 million of overtime that was paid out in 2016. That amounted to roughly about 100,000 hours of overtime that was worked by our employees. give or take. I mean, and I'm just looking at the average wages, calculating what each individual was made based upon that. So
The extra hours?
About 103,000 hours of additional overtime that was worked, okay, at time and a half. To fill that with full-time employees, we would have to hire 61 people to fill those hours, because an employee doesn't work with their vacation time. They don't work 2,000 hours. They work roughly about 1,700 hours in a year. So that's 61 employees we would have to hire. The cost of salary, if you hire them at, we'll just assume the average wage, and I can put this calculation together and pull it back to the for everyone to share it with everyone. If the average wage of all of our employees, and this is rolling up what everyone was making that was earning overtime, that comes in at about $75,000, maybe even a little higher than that. So at that rate, at time and a half, plus the benefit cost, I think we would, to hire 61 people at that rate, it would be considerably higher and more expensive than just paying the $5.7 million in overtime.
Okay, if I could ask a couple more questions about this. So I understand that. However, I do have some concerns about just overtime in general. So I don't know if the rest of the council is aware of this, but we have one employee whose overtime pay was $100,000 in 2016 on top of the normal pay. And in that particular case, I think the normal pay was $60,000 or something. So I have serious concerns about the policy, and I'm not really even clear on what our overtime policy is, how it's approved, what are the circumstances. I mean, going through this list, it seems as if it is, and I don't know if this is, last year represents more overtime compared to other years. I haven't compared them, but maybe you know.
I think that, I don't know if it was any different than the prior year. What I would tell you is we've had some issues, and the ECC is one, where we had challenges with hiring people and filling positions, but yet we still had to have somebody answering the phones. And so we had a group of dedicated employees that were willing to work additional hours, obviously for time and a half, to make sure that the phones were covered, so that those calls were answered. And then we realized also that we had a challenge with hiring people at the entry-level salary that we were paying for those positions. And it was creating more and more vacancies in the ECC. So last year, we addressed that and tried to raise the entry-level salary. And we've been able now in 2017 to close that gap on the number of employees, because we're actually attracting people at a higher salary coming in to work that job. So the overtime is down because we have more full-time employees that are working in that department. So that's one example that I would point to, is that some of that, there are some factors that are at play that's not just simply saying, okay, well, how are we managing this? We know that we have to make sure that we have, in the emergency communication center, we have to have those seats occupied to answer those calls as they come in.
Okay, but that's just one department. This extends through every single department. The overtime pay is, I really think that we need to have a serious conversation about when is overtime warranted, who's approving it, and I think that we as a city council need to be made aware that this is happening, because $5 million, I mean, if we said no overtime, that's $5 million that we would not have to be trying to squeeze services in the city unless the overtime represents crucial work time. And I just don't know if that's the case.
Well, I think often we could certainly have the discussion with every department, and we can talk about it. Each department is going to be different. But let's look at the fire department right now. The fire department has 10 vacancies, but they're still staffing the number of engine companies that we have. So that means that they're generating a considerable amount of overtime right now because they have vacancies. The police department, I think there's currently 13 vacancies of officers. In order to continue to provide the level of service, the level of coverage we have, we need to then hire back people on overtime to fill those slots. So those are elements that come into play, is that you end up having to staff to those levels. If we could certainly direct both departments to say, don't do that, but it's going to mean fewer police officers on the street. It's going to mean that we're going to have to shut down one engine in the fire department. And we could do that. And in essence, that's what we're going to be talking about doing as part of closing the budget gap. So.
I'm not making this decision. I'm just bringing it up as an observation, and we don't have the numbers. And I would like to see this report. I know I've talked to Director Scroggins about this already. I would like to see the report presented with totals at the bottom of each column, and I would like to see it on the website in a sortable fashion so that citizens can take a look at it and do their own sorting the way that they prefer, rather than looking at it just as a PDF. So those are two requests. I'd like to have a report about what is our overtime policy, who approves it, how is it decided, and get these numbers presented to the citizens in a way that they can really use them rather than just read them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Moore, did you have anything on this?
Not on that particular topic, but I would like to look at the community development slide. Mr. Manager, if you could go back to that slide. I would just like to make sure that everyone is aware, when we're talking about expense reductions in the community development department, one of the things I've asked the manager to provide us the next time is a breakout of where those funds are being utilized most. I would hazard a guess that a lot of those funds are going to be used in our heritage neighborhoods. I would hazard a guess that a predominant amount of that may be utilized in the First District. And to that point, I'd just like to mention that when the city of Peoria gets a cold or the sniffles, the First District, parts of the First District gets pneumonia. And a lot of what is happening in the Community Development Department is keeping the parts of the First District, and I'm specifically referencing the North Valley and the South Side, is keeping those areas afloat. We can mince words as to whether there was a disinvestment in this area, but we can't deny that the area has suffered from immense lack of investment, and the funds that are coming through the community development are helping to try to bring those areas back. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's no reduction in community development. No, I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm just suggesting that we need to be smart at when we do take a fine pencil to the Community Development Department to make sure that we are not exacerbating those problems that have existed for decades in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have Councilmember Euler and then Councilman Ruckriegel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 2 points. First one, I want to piggyback off of Councilwoman Akeson's comments on overtime in regards to potential cuts in workforce. How do we ensure that that is not just made up with overtime next year? And then the second thing is, we went through the top line revenues to the general fund and discussed the fact that we're roughly $7 million, projecting to be $7 million under on revenue. Where do we project to be on expenses?
Well, if I could jump back, what we said, and excuse me here as I pull this back up, the 2018 projection was that we were at, if we didn't do anything, the projections that we gave you earlier in the year was that that our trend would be that we would be at $101.2 million of expense. That's the $7.9 million gap. So what we're trying to do is, we can close that $7.9 million gap by cutting, and that's what this...
Actually, I was referring, sorry, to clarify, to 2017, and we're projecting to be short 2017.
Correct. In 2017, in the general fund, I want to say that we're going to be anticipating right now probably about $5 million, Jim? Director Scroggins, I think, or is it 6? So, and I think if we look at the August financial report, I can't remember if that was it, when we were looking at it. That's again, one of the reasons why we've got that trend line that we're looking at, that we need to curtail that and close that back up. So.
Reason for my questions on this is I think that not only do we need to be talking about 2018, but I think we need to be talking about 2017. And overtime may be a part of that conversation, because where we sit right now, we're going to consume the majority of our unallocated cash by the end of the year. And then we're going to struggle to pay bills next year, even if we do find a balanced budget. Based on the timing of when bills come in and bond payments come due, it is going to be a very tough year to keep the bills paid, even if we find a way to balance this budget, if we consume the majority of the remainder of the unallocated cash by the end of the year. So I think that part of these discussions in the next few weeks have to be part of discussing how we're going to get a handle on the rest of 2017 and what measures to take there.
We have directed departments outside of road funding to curtail capital spending. That's been one area that we've tried to put the brakes on capital spending as much as we can. I've directed all departments to be judicious about what they're spending their dollars on currently, so that we can try and minimize the amount of spend that we have through the remainder of this year. So that has been a direction that I've given them to try and curtail that spending through the end of the year. So, thanks.
Thank you.
Councilmember Ruckriegel.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you for the information we have in front of us. And I agree with a lot of the comments that have been made by my colleagues around the horseshoe here tonight. Couple observations. I do a lot of budgeting. It's kind of what I do in my daytime job. And it seems like the best advice when you budget for a business, when you budget for a government, is on the revenue side, you be conservative. On the expense side, you go a little larger. And that helps right the ship. For the past couple of years, it seems like our estimates on our revenues have not hit into those, which ultimately goes into our reserve funds being minimized. And I say that because we've got some real challenges in front of us over the next couple of years. We know that our sales tax base is always questionable, and even if we can grow that to what we would consider a significant degree, it's not going to happen overnight, and that's also a very hard challenge. And any city government that is deciding to put their bets on just sales tax at this point aren't going to get very far in years to come. Property tax. We know what is going to be coming on a 3-year cycle as we see the home sales going forward, and I'm sitting right next to somebody who can educate us all very well on what those home sales look like right now. And that's going to have an effect not only on the houses that are sold, but the ones that are around those, because our property tax line is going to change, even if it is maintained the same percentage that we allocate. And then we've got utility tax. It's interesting that we were kind of behind the 8 ball on that whenever we look at certain things, because we know that as things become more efficient, there's going to be less energy use. But the one that kind of stood out to me, and I appreciate you talking about this whenever we had the city meetings, was telephones. Because we know that landlines are diminishing in use, and therefore that goes away. And I say that because it seems like every 2 years we're having to fight the same fight, because we put a Band-Aid on the budget for 2 years just to get us over that cycle. And I'd like to really be able to hone in at our next meeting on the revenue line, and I'd like to be extremely conservative on that, because I think that that's the first thing we need to be talking about. We need to know how much we have to spend before we can know what we can spend it on. Every household, every business has got to be able to do that. It's the only way you pay your bills. We've got a self-imposed policy of reserve funds of 25% of our budget. It's in our audit. We've also got in there a line that says that if it ever dips below that, we will correct that within 5 years. We're at a point now that if we tried to correct that within 5 years, it would decimate our city budget. But we've also got to talk about how we rebuild that. We are within, if we would shadow next year the same way we did this year, we're going to be having less than $2 million in reserve funds. We can't, as a city, do that. And I think that those are the conversations we need to have. We need to get the revenues right before we can start on the expenses, and then we got to come back to what we can afford, not what we'd like. With that being said, let's talk about the expenses that we've got in front of us a little bit. I look forward to an overtime report. And in my business, overtime is something that you try to manage. But there's good overtime and bad overtime, and I think that as we get that report, there might be some that we find is justified, some that we might find that there's some places that we can cut. With that also, and I appreciate the efforts here to do a across-the-line budget cut on expenses. My concern there is that uses the rationalization that each department has the same weight in what they do and the cuts that they've received beforehand. And I think that we've got to do a deeper dive to be able to find out where we cut appropriately and not appropriately. Community development, there may be certain things in there that we find it to be harder to cut because those are our front line for our older historic neighborhood or our heritage neighborhoods. But, and that's just one example. But we need to find out by diving deep individually. To do an across-the-board cut has not helped us in the past. It won't help us in the future. And my goal as we go forward here is not to look to 2018, 2019, but to look out to 2025. Because we need to start projecting this thing out so that we're not back here in 2 years from now. Not every city has to have this same conversation on their budget, because they make some hard choices and they make the right choices. And I think that we need to spend the time over this time to really delve into the revenues that we have and what we will have ongoing. I look forward to having those reports back. I think that you're also going to give me a report back on the take-home policy. And then I'd add one more on that is separating out what we're going to be putting into roads, because I think that roads are a key issue for our constituents. The rest of the capital, how do we get the most out of the rest of the capital? If we've got vehicles on the road and we can get an extra 18 months to 24 months out of it, that's a huge savings for the taxpayer. So can we have a plan or some thought process on how we extend the life of our capital that we have? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Sear.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. One quick question on overtime. Mr. Urick, when I was running the Peoria Riverman many years ago, we were charged by the Civic Center time and a half as part of usage of our police officers. So question to you today, we have many events downtown, races and all kinds of things. Are we charging all these for all these events, basically for security for all these events?
We currently don't have a fee for special events. That is something that we have talked about, and I think that I think staff has some ideas on how we might want to roll that out. It's interesting the way that you raise that. The Civic Center hires the police officers on an off-duty rate, and that they're working overtime. But it's a special detail that they have for those contracts. So I think we can certainly look at that. It may be a way that we can tackle this instead of us charging it and billing through a number of at least the policing side of this and the traffic enforcement, that we could look at doing something very similar to that, where we do an off-duty detail that can do that, and then we just simply charge for the public works side or the fire side. But that's something that we can look at and come back to you with a report on the special events and what are going on with that as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And maybe just to dovetail on that, Mr. Manager, I think for public information, it would also be helpful for them to understand how much we really provide back to the community in a lot of these services. I mean, in some of the events, without picking any specific event out, some of these expenses are huge when we're talking about, in some cases, blocking off a lot of intersections around the community with a lot of officers watching those intersections, Public Works closing those intersections, and not that it wasn't something that we felt like it was our place to help whatever that cause was. At the end of the day, right now, we don't have that luxury anymore. So clearly, there's going to have to be some type of a compensation to the city if they want to do that, which cuts into the non-for-profits, profits. It's kind of not-for-profits profits, but to their bottom line of what they used to bring home. It's going to be a necessary expense for us to pass along, but I think it will be helpful for them to really understand how many of those events we do every year. It's not just a handful. It's tens and tens and maybe more. So I think that will be helpful for them to understand. And as we get into some of this other information on potential on the revenue side that a couple people have asked for, I think it's going to be important for everyone to understand right now that in many cases, a lot of those entities aren't paying anything for some of those services. And so now that it may be a time for that to happen as well, as painful as it may be. Anything else for the manager up to this point? A lot of this is going to be information back, Mr. Manager. I think one of the things that will be helpful for us, especially in light of the fact that you've outlined a potential reduction in one of the fire stations, is we and the public need to have a better understanding of the number of calls that our fire department is going out on in all the different categories, so we can better understand what impact that reduction is going to have on those calls, and what potentially, if there's some of those calls that we're going on that maybe it's not necessary that we go on as many of those calls as we currently do, and if we could do that without sacrificing as much manpower. So I know that you've been working on compiling a lot of those numbers, but I think that that's something that we all have to have so we can get our arms around the number of calls, because it's a lot of them.
We can certainly get that back to you. So on the revenue side, we do have somewhat limited options as far as raising revenues, and we can certainly, I'll try and walk through those for you here briefly. Currently, our property taxes and the total of our property taxes are about 19% of our total revenues. This is an area where you do have flexibility. You can raise real estate taxes in a number of different areas. We currently levy for the library, for pensions, and for operations. We have seen that our operating levies have declined from $6.7 million in 2010 to $700,000 in 2017. But this is one area where you could potentially raise revenue. A 1 penny increase in the tax rate citywide generates about $200,000 of additional revenue. Next is the sales tax. Sales taxes we are very reliant on sales taxes. You do have the ability to raise the sales tax rate, the home rule sales tax rate. It is currently set at 1.75%. Our sales tax rate in the city right now is 9%, of which 5% goes to the state, 2.75% goes to the city. The county gets 0.75%, and schools gets 0.5%. So that's the breakout on the sales tax side. You do have the ability to raise the natural gas utility tax from 3.5% to 5%. Currently, that's about 6% of our total revenues. We've started to see some decline in some of the telephone usage and the telephone excise tax that we've been getting. Natural gas has been relatively constant, so a 1.5% increase there, and that rate should generate about $1 million, I believe, is what we've anticipated. On the residential garbage collection contract that we have, that's about 3% of our total revenues. If you were to raise that on $1 a month, it would be about $456,000 annually. The fee is currently set at $14 a month, and it does not cover the cost of the service currently. So this is one area that, with what the residential trash fund owes the general fund, if you were to raise this rate, this would allow us to start to repay back the general fund. I think it's right now it's about $4 million, I think, that it owes the general fund in kind of in a due-to situation. So that would certainly, if we were able to do that, that would be money that would go right to the bottom line in terms of helping the replenish the fund balance in the general fund.
We have a question. Councilman Regenbach.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm not sure if I saw this somewhere else, but what would it need to be raised to cover the actual current cost?
To cover the current cost, and to put some money back into the general fund, it would be about $17 a month is where we'd need to set that. So it would be about a $3 per month increase.
And when is the RFP due back?
Don't know where. November 4th is when it's coming
4th.
back.
So we'll have to make the decision on this before we know what the actual cost will be going forward.
That's correct.
All right, thank you.
Another option, and we talked about this, we have talked about this in the past, is looking at the establishment of a stormwater utility fee. We could certainly look at taking an approach that many other households are using, many other communities are using. The monthly fees per household have been anywhere from $3.71 to $9.72. Establishing this as a dedicated utility would allow us to get into prolonging the infrastructure life that we currently have and trying to tackle the backlog of nearly 400 drainage projects that are estimated anywhere at $1.5 to $6 million. And then if we were to look at this as well, the one aspect about it that I think is something that we need to consider is that it could offset about $2.5 million of current general fund spending that we have that we're really dedicated towards wet weather projects, wet weather issues. And then it would also be applied, since it's a utility, everyone would pay. There is no exemption for this. So non-property tax paying parcels of property, those churches and schools and government buildings, everyone would pay. This would be creating a utility to run our drainage program, because the reality is that when it rains and then that water runs off of a property, it doesn't know if that property pays property taxes or not. The water just knows that it's going to find its lowest level.
Okay, we have a question. Councilman Regenbach.
Thank you again, Mr. Mayor. When you say this could offset the $2.5 million, is that just hypothetical at this point, or do you have a dollar amount pegged that would need? I mean,
well,
pretty.
That would take current expenses of $2.5 million a year that we're currently paying for in drainage and in the sewer fund, and shift those into the stormwater utility fee to fund that. You would still have other costs that you would have to build in. If you recall, when we talked about the One Water Committee had put together a model program of what they felt needed to be put in place in a program. And I think that ranged anywhere from $8 to $12 million was the total cost on a full wet weather program if we were to do that. So just like we're doing with roads, if we consider that your stormwater infrastructure is infrastructure, and the drainage issues that we have that are causing problems throughout our community, it's an infrastructure issue, and we're not putting enough money towards our infrastructure. And this is one way of doing that. And you set it up as a utility, and you dedicate those funds for that to be able to manage the system.
As a request, I would like to see what it would be. You know, the range of fees from other communities is pretty broad there, so if you could be a little more specific on that, if we had a $4 fee, $5 fee, whatever, how much would that raise, and what could the potential offset be for the other? I think we saw as 2 years ago when we raised the revenue for the road projects, that when we can demonstrate to the community that these fees, these taxes are going for specific things, it's much more palatable for everybody. And I think the pie charts on the website have helped demonstrate to folks that we've raised this much money from these fees and we've spent this much money on road projects. So that'll be something I'll be very adamant about if any of these options become reality. If I could just back up again to that garbage fee, I think that's also critical for me as I talk to folks, that when that fee went up from the $6 that had been stuck at for a number of years, we raised that to cover the actual costs. And of course, that cost has continued to accelerate, but I think, again, the discussion with my constituents is much easier when I tell them, you know, this is truly truth in budgeting. The garbage pickup costs this much, and your fee takes care of that. Mm-hmm. When we start subsidizing it with other revenue sources, then it starts to get a little cloudy. So I'll definitely be wanting further discussion on that personally, at least, because I think being as clear and concise that this fee covers this service you're getting, that's a discussion that people appreciate. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then lastly, we just, again, had the various options that we have. We've already talked about the special event charges. We're preparing a report back on the vehicle fee. And then we had some items that we had put in the budget challenge tool, obviously the packaged liquor tax, looking at establishing a nonprofit fire service fee, or discussing with the hospitals a payment in lieu of taxes, where we could look at a voluntary program with the hospitals or other institutions that we have in the community that don't pay taxes. And we would be open to any other suggestions the council may have. But that really concludes the prepared PowerPoint that we have. I don't know if there's any questions on.
Well, I think we had asked a number of questions, requesting quite a bit of information back on the operating side of this, which will probably help us to refine this down. But I do think that there probably is justification for a little bit of feedback to you on the revenue side, because if everything's on the table, we're not going to get ourselves very close to probably where we need to do. I'll lead off and just say respectfully to the budget challenge and to all of the community meetings that you did, and I applaud the staff for doing those. I mean, clearly they have not been as effective as we'd like them to be, but not at fault for us to going out in the districts and do that. I don't need to poll anybody, because I literally hear it on a daily basis when it comes to property taxes and sales taxes. Those two, and I haven't talked to all the council members. I've talked to a good majority of my peers. Those two are not going to be on the table for this budget, Mr. Manager. I do not see us being in a position to adjust either one of those. So when we look at a lot of these other revenue fees, I think that some of them are potentials. The stormwater utility is an area that is, as much as it's going to be a new fee out there, and it's going to include everybody. This is no surprise to anybody. We've been talking about a stormwater utility for 15, 20 years, literally. And we know, just because of the timeline, and that, and for the public that doesn't know, we will be finally meeting with the U.S. EPA in a couple weeks in hopes that we can get this to a point where we can actually come to an agreement on this whole thing. But the CSO, stormwater utility, is an area that we have to do. I don't know what that fee should be. I don't know what's appropriate. I know that a lot of our not-for-profits out there are concerned about this and what it's going to do to their budgets next year, so we have to get that information out there just for their, it's not relief because they know it's coming, but if we are to institute a stormwater utility, when do you anticipate that would take effect?
Realistically, I don't think that we could have it ready to go any earlier, and this would be aggressive even doing that by mid-year. It would have to be, July 1 would be when we would see it going into effect. We'd need that kind of lead time to get everything ready to go.
Okay. Well, that's a little, not much comfort, but it's not something that's going to hit January 1. Right. So your intention would be, as Councilman Regenbach requested, would be to look at what some of these other communities are doing, but also knowing what, we have a pretty good idea where we're probably going to land with US EPA, so we'll have to base it according to that projection as well.
That's correct.
Council, we're open for further feedback on the revenue side. If anybody disagrees with my comment on property taxes and sales taxes, by all means, I'm sure the manager would like to hear that, but those are big chunks of money that I don't think we can depend on to balance our budget next year. I have Councilman Ruckriegel and then Euler.
Thank you, Mayor. And I would just echo those comments. The taxpayers of Peoria have got the weight of this city budget on their backs. There's not much more room that we can burden them with. And I think that the property tax and sales tax have got to be off the table. We can't keep taxing ourselves into prosperity. It hasn't worked in the past. It's not going to work in the future. And we see where if we don't change the way we do business, what our future looks like. And so I would echo your comments too on we've got to give security to Peorians that those two taxes are off the table.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Euler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things that's going to help with our financial position long term is if we can improve our housing market, and part of the issue with that is where our taxes already sit. I hear on a daily basis that I'm not going to buy a house in Peoria because the taxes are too high. My tax payment is going to be higher than my mortgage payment. So this is not the place that I want to live. They want to look at surrounding cities around us, and then these houses sit vacant, the property values decline, and it further impacts the neighborhood. So that's a death spiral that we cannot afford to continue to go down. So the property tax topic has to come off the table. And I would echo the same thing with sales tax. We're fighting a losing battle when we have a sales tax that is not competitive, and we push people to go to other municipalities to do it cheaper and do it better, and I hear it on a daily basis. So those two we can't win with, but I do certainly encourage us to look at more things that are going to recover costs of service, like the discussion on the garbage fee and potential hospital pilot and the nonprofit charges, because we are providing a service and the service is being used, but everyone else is having to pay for it. The taxpayers are paying for services that are being provided to entities that are not paying for it. I've met with both the fire department and the police department, and they're both struggling with a significant number of calls for services to entities that do not pay taxes, whether it be false alarm calls with the police department or calls to the hospital or a nursing home to help get somebody back in bed. And we really have to look at how we're going to right-size the things that are costing us money that we're passing on to everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Moore, did you have anything to add at this portion?
No, thank you. Not at this time. I did provide the city manager with a list of about 10 items, some of which we've discussed tonight, and some of them we have not, that he has indicated he will bring back a report back next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Sear.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Manager, last question for me tonight. And we had this discussion before. I'm very proud that the 5 days we spent together a couple months ago for our strategic planning. And I think it's a very important tool how we communicate our priorities with our constituent. And it's my personal opinion that the budget, the planning here that we're doing, needs to mirror what our priorities are. So my question to you is really simple. When is this plan going to be ready so we can study it and approve it and really work on prioritizing the budget?
Thank you, Councilman. And as we discussed, I think that what I would like to do is get Lyle scheduled here so that he could be back before the end of October so that we can lock that up with council and we can prioritize the list. But as I mentioned to you, the list that we have, you've given us a list of policy priorities and management priorities that, while you haven't said these are your top ones, you've identified within that the priorities that the council has identified. And it's a workable list, and it can be built into this budget and the priorities that we have. So as we present it and we bring it forward, it will incorporate that for you as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My main concern, though, is we were all at those meetings, those 5 meetings we had. To me, we need to communicate with the public. Now, we know what our priorities are. We were all at the meetings, but the public was not there. So I'd like for them to see the plan so they know how we're thinking about moving forward the next few years and especially prioritizing this budget.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for all the work you've done in this presentation.
Mr. Manager, I want to try to ask this in a very respectful way. I think as long as we've worked together, I've always tried my hardest not to get into a situation where I micromanage. I don't do your job. I don't want to do your job because that's not my job. It's not our job. But one of the things that was brought up earlier this evening in terms of the amount of money that will be spent operationally in the city in the last 3 months of the year. And our concern that, as many times happens, sometimes money gets spent, even though we're in a tough place, money gets spent just because spend it and we'll worry about it next year. I don't want to ask you specifically what a number should be, but I would like you to come back to us maybe with a thought on any expenses over a specific line between now and the end of the year, regardless of whether it's been approved or not. If you would ask your department heads to just affirm with you whether or not that's something that needs to happen before the end of the year. And again, I don't say that to second guess any of the departments or anyone else, but I think it's really important for us to definitely show that extra level of discipline here as we go down the rest of this road. I can tell, I really appreciate the fact that we have so many staff members here with us tonight who do a lot of good work and bring us a lot of information. Based on the information that we requested tonight, there's going to be a lot more requested, which equates into staff time and so on. And I know that I speak for everybody that sits around this horseshoe that the last thing that any of us want to do is have a reduction in force. And so every dollar out there is very important to us. We definitely don't want to fuel any worry and consternation that there might be within departments, because we know there are going to be cuts. But we're trying to be as sensitive to those as we can. And I just think that if we could put that one mechanism in place, it would just give us a little. I appreciate that. Thank you. Mr. Manager, I'm not seeing any lights on the board here, but is there anything else that you would like further direction on in these areas that you didn't get this evening?
No, I think I've got some good direction back from you. I think that what we'll do is, we have a regularly scheduled meeting set for the 10th. My intent would be that we get to you the report backs before that council meeting, and then we can come back on the 11th, which is the next policy session, which is on the Wednesday evening. We'll present the budget that we'll prepare for you. That will be done at that point in time, and then we can really roll up our sleeves and get into it at that period. And then, I think what we'll do is come back to you with some suggestions about a timeline to getting this approved that we can build in with that next week as well.
Yeah, I think that'd be very helpful, knowing what the timeline is going to be with the extra meetings that we have in here, and when we hope to get to the finish line on those. Okay. I'm not. The floor is still open. If the council has any additional requests for information, if you think of something after this evening's meeting that you would like included in that information, by all means, contact the manager and have that included with the information that we'll be getting back this weekend. So last call on anything for the manager, and seeing none, we have a motion to close the policy session by Councilman Sear, seconded by Councilmember Euler. Please cast your ballots to close the public hearing, public policy session. Councilmember Moore?
Yes, please.
The motion passes unanimously. Madam Clerk?
We're at public comment regarding the proposed 2018-2019 biennial budget.
So we have a place on the agenda. This isn't the citizens to address opportunity. This is a portion for if there's anyone in the public that would like to address the council in regards to any of the discussion that we just had on the budget and the first round of information that we have coming back. The microphone would be open for comments. Okay. I'm seeing none there, Madam Clerk.
We're at citizens' opportunity to address the city council or town board.
Okay. I don't have any cards of anybody that wanted to address us, but the floor is open for anyone that would like to address the council on budget or any other issue. Okay. Seeing none, Madam Clerk.
Okay. I don't believe there's an executive session tonight, so we're at adjournment.
I would like to remind the listening audience before we close that there will be a regular council meeting next Tuesday night. There will be another policy session similar to this evening next Wednesday night at 6 o'clock. So next week we'll have a regular meeting Tuesday at 6, a policy session on budget on Wednesday at 6. With that said, we have a motion to adjourn by Councilman Sear, seconded by Councilmember Turner. If there's no further discussion, please cast your ballots to adjourn tonight's meeting. Councilmember Moore.
Yes, thank you.
That motion passes unanimously, and this evening's meeting is adjourned. Thank you.